All right, so today we are studying the skeletal system. And here what I mean by that is the physiology of bone, the histology of bone. Y'all remember our levels of organization? Can you name them? Might help. Very good. So as we go through these levels of organization, you remember when we did the skin, we said keratin was kind of the signature chemical of skin because it's found only there, but also melanin because it's so prominent in the skin, even though it's not only found there. What would you say is the main chemical of the skeletal system, the thing that imparts its main functions? Looking at chemical at any level, whether it's an organic chemical or just a simple mineral, what do you associate with the skeletal system? What's the main characteristic of bones? They're hard. What makes them hard? They're the only hard tissue you have, so what makes them hard? What do you make sure you have plenty of in your diet to keep your bones in good shape? Vitamin D is one thing, but what else that would make them hard? Calcium. So calcium is kind of the main chemical we would associate with the skeletal system, and we're going to look at a lot of different aspects of calcium, not only where it is in bones, but also how you regulate calcium in the body, not just in the bones. So we'll learn the cells of bone, the tissues of bone, and of course, what are the main organs of the skeletal system? What's your skeleton made of? Bones, and those are considered organs. They're living tissue. A lot of people think of them as dead because when you study them, you're looking at preserved specimens. Yeah, bone's living tissue. If you ever break a bone, it bleeds like crazy. Yep. It's hard to imagine if you've never broken a bone, but yeah, they do bleed. All right, so beyond bones, you also have other tissues and structures. You've got ligaments. Do you remember what ligaments do? They hold bones to each other, so they connect bones to bones. And contrast those with tendons. What do tendons do? No, ligaments hold bones together. Tendons attach muscles to bones. Okay? So tendons and ligaments are both important, but tendons are kind of a bridge between the muscular system and a skeletal system. And we'll get to joints, the joint components right now. We're just learning the tissue types. There's cartilage in your joints. There are joint capsules, which are actually fibrous connective tissue. But we're putting joints on test 3, not test 2. Okay? Usually I test on joints and skeleton together. For y'all, I'm splitting them up. So we'll worry more about joints. It's a totally separate chapter of its own anyway. All right, so in our introduction to the skeletal system, when I post this PowerPoint online, you'll be able to follow that link up there. Anything that's blue underlined is a link. And I could try it, I guess. But let's go through this slide first. So you've got 2 kinds of bone tissue. This is not 2 kinds of connective tissue found in the skeletal system. This is specifically of bone itself. There are 2 kinds of bone tissue, and we just call them compact bone and spongy bone most of the time, but please notice that they have other names. So compact bone is also called dense bone or cortical bone. When my husband broke his wrist, the last time I went with him to see the bone doctor, he said, yeah, we're getting this cortical bone growing back. So that's a term that gets used. And we'll look at the structure of both of these in just a minute, but compact bone is basically what you would think of as solid bone. And spongy bone is called that because it looks like a sponge. It's got a lot of holes in it. Okay, so which one is the most, the major portion of a bone? Is it compact or spongy? Compact, and you can see that on the screen. 80% of your bone mass is compact bone and only 20% of the mass is spongy bone. Part of the reason for that is spongy bone doesn't have as much mass for the same volume, but part of it is that you just have more cortical bone, more compact bone. All right, let's see if that link will work. Nope, it will not. So let me just figure out where the heck we were. See if I can get it to work here. Maybe, maybe not. Nope, can't get the links to work. Okay, so moving on. There are two types of cartilage associated with the skeletal system. We already studied cartilage and its locations. So you already know that hyaline cartilage is what the embryonic skeleton starts out as. That's the last bullet under hyaline cartilage. It's the model for formation of most bones. And we'll be taking a look at embryonic development specifically. But notice it's also the costal cartilage. What's costal cartilage? What does costal mean?
Ribs.
Ribs. So costal cartilage is the cartilage that attaches ribs to the sternum. And we looked at that last week in lab, excuse me. Where hyaline cartilage covers the ends of some bone, there it is called articular cartilage. And articular refers to joints. And we'll be looking at that when we have lab on Wednesday. And then also cartilage within the growth plates. Now, you knew you had growth plates in your bones, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we'll study those on Wednesday in lab as well, but we'll probably get through the growth of them today. The other kind of cartilage, fibrocartilage, you already know where that's found, right? Intervertebral discs, pubic symphysis, cartilage pads of the knee. We learn those locations when we learn this tissue type. So basically, fibrocartilage is for weight bearing. Anywhere you're going to put a lot of compression on a joint, you might put a little pad of fibrocartilage. And there are other joints that have them. For example, you may have a little pad of fibrocartilage not only in your knees, but also in your jaw joint and in one of the joints of your thumb. You might have a little pad of fibrocartilage there. Okay, so then in addition to bone tissue and cartilage, we also have the fibrous connective tissue in the ligaments and the tendons, also in the joint capsules, which we're saving for later. Okay, and do you remember what kind of tissue this is specifically? Is it loose or dense?
It's loose.
In tendons?
No.
It's dense. Is it regular or irregular?
Irregular.
Nope. Man, so why is it regular? Remember, you put regular wherever you're always pulling it in the same direction. Okay? Tendons always pull in one direction. Ligaments, likewise. Fibrous capsules, on the other hand, just like the dermis, are irregular. Okay, last question. Is it collagenous or elastic?
Tendons?
Yeah. Collagenous. Okay, so it's dense, regular, collagenous connective tissue. Both of them. And what you might remember from when we studied that tissue type is if you tear it, it doesn't heal very well. So once you've torn a tendon or a ligament, it's really hard to repair. All right, so we've kind of gone through the major tissue types, and now we're going to look very briefly at some features of where they are. So in blue in this diagram, you have hyaline cartilage. In that sort of dark reddish brown, you've got the fibrocartilage. Where do you find articular cartilage? Where's that? Articular cartilage? It's labeled up in the shoulder. Articular cartilage is always at the ends of a bone where it forms a joint. Articular means joint. It's also labeled at the knee. But look, it's also labeled up in the shoulder. So it's not specific to knees. Articular cartilage is found at any joint. And of course, costal cartilage, that one is limited, right? Costal cartilage is always ribs. And you've got the cartilage of the intervertebral discs, colored reddish brown, so that's fibrocartilage. So just get a good sense of where you're going to find the different kinds of cartilage, okay? Epiphyseal plates are labeled in the little box on the top right. You see it? Okay, so epiphyseal plates are the growth plates. They're made of cartilage, and they will close up eventually. Yours, by the way, are almost all already closed. Okay, so now we're going to shift our attention to functions. And of course, we know that bones perform basic functions of support and protection, and they give the muscle something to have as levers to provide movement. Does anybody remember what hemopoiesis is? Well, you may not remember because I may not have introduced the term. What does hemo tell you? Hemo? Like hemoglobin or hemorrhage? Hemorrhage means what? It would be a bad thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so hemorrhage means you're bleeding. So what does hemo tell you? Blood. So hemopoiesis, poiesis is a Greek root that means making. So then what's hemopoiesis? Making blood. And what part of bones make blood? Pretty close. It's actually the marrow. And the marrow is, there are two kinds of marrow. There's red marrow and yellow marrow. And red marrow is where you do hemopoiesis. And yellow marrow is for fat storage. So our last bullet, storage of mineral and energy reserves. What mineral are we storing in bone? Calcium. And what energy reserve are we storing? That would be fat. Okay, now the last question on this page, what are the vital functions? That, remember, means you can't live without them. Do you have other places to store your fat reserves?
Yes.
Plenty, right? Because the hypodermis will store as much fat as you need it to. Do you have other ways of getting calcium besides getting it from your bones? Can't you eat it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. So you can't make calcium, it's a mineral, but you can certainly eat it. In fact, you better be eating it, right? So I would say that's not really vital in and of itself to store it, but if you couldn't get calcium out of your bones and you weren't getting enough in your diet, then you might be in trouble, okay? But you probably wouldn't die from a lack of calcium, you would just rob it out of your bones. So let's back up to support and protection and movement. What are we supporting with our skeletal system? Internal organs, including the ribs, support the lungs. Lungs are pretty vital, right? If you think about all the things that would kill me in minutes instead of hours or days, don't you think breathing's pretty high on the list? Yeah, okay, so the movement also, you have movement of your rib cage. And that movement depends on the bones of the rib cage to be able to support it. And of course, protection, you protect your brain and the cranial cavity, and you protect your heart with the sternum and ribs. So those are all kind of vital. Okay, so now we're going to look at tissue types. So we're going to look at a close-up of this. Now, we actually did this in lab last week, right? So right now what we're looking at specifically is the periosteum, and the periosteum is for bone what the perichondrium was for cartilage. It's just a layer of fibrous tissue surrounding the bone. So in this image, if you look at the periosteum, you see it has two layers. It has a fibrous layer and a cellular layer. And the cells of that internal cellular layer are bone-forming cells. They can make new bones. So if you break a bone, they'll wake up and they'll activate and they'll repair the bone. Make sense?
Cell and fibrous layers?
The cellular layer and the fibrous layer are the two tissue types. So that fibrous layer is an irregular, collagenous, dense connective tissue. And its main job is to maintain the integrity of the bone. If it gets broken, if you break a bone, that periosteum can help kind of hold the broken shards together. If you just crunch a bone, compress it, then the periosteum may keep the sharp edges of bone from getting out and affecting nearby soft tissues. You also see perforating fibers there at the bottom of that image. Perforating fibers are collagen fibers that run from the fibrous layer of the periosteum into the bone itself. And you can only see them in this picture because they're ripping the periosteum loose. Ordinarily, those perforating fibers tightly connect the periosteum into the bone tissue itself. Okay, so that's the periosteum, and then as we go into the bone itself, here we're looking at spongy bone. How can you tell from the picture you're looking at spongy bone? Aside from the fact that spongy bone is labeled right there. No, that's not how you can tell. Do you see in the background on the left where it says medullary cavity? Do you see how that bone just consists of like little struts or beams with lots of empty space around it? So that's the way we would draw spongy bone. Spongy bone has the same basic construct of dense bone. It has osteocytes, it has the bone tissue itself, and then on that surface layer we have what we call the endosteum. So what does endo tell you? Inside. Whereas in the previous picture we were looking at the periosteum. Where's that? On the outside of the entire bone. Anywhere in the inside where you have hollow spaces, you're going to have endosteum. And endosteum is not truly a membrane because it's only one layer thick. It doesn't have at least two tissue types. But look at the kinds of cells it has. It has osteoprogenitor cells. It has osteoblasts. It has these giant, very cool osteoclasts. So osteoprogenitor cells are the stem cells of bone. You'll notice you see only one of them in that picture. Osteoprogenitor cells being stem cells means they'll wake up if you need them. And generally that would be if you broke a bone. Okay, so stem cells generally are retired, right? They're just sitting there just in case. Osteoblasts, blast tells you that's the cell that makes new bone. And bone is a living tissue, and those osteocytes, which are surrounded by bone inside, they don't have an unlimited lifespan. They may live decades, but they don't live forever. So when the osteocytes die, the bone that they're supporting starts to degrade. And that's the job of the osteoclast, is to get rid of the old bone. Once an osteocyte dies, the osteoclast will digest away and remove the bone that it is no longer being supported, and then the osteoblasts will come in and make new bone. Does that make sense to everybody? It's kind of like when they fix roads. When they fix the road properly, they actually scrape off the old road surface and then lay down a new one. So osteoclasts are the scrapers, and osteoblasts will form the new bone. I'm not happy with the representation of the relative sizes of these cells. Osteocytes, osteoblasts, and osteoprogenitor cells are all about the same size. Osteoclasts, on the other hand, are huge. They're just like giants compared to everybody else. So I think in this picture, it's the osteocytes they made too big. Okay? Just kind of as a general rule. All right, so where do you find spongy bone? And that lovely picture in lower left tells you exactly what spongy bone looks like. Spongy bone is never on the surface of a bone, because then it would be leaking stuff, right? So you need that compact bone on the surface. This picture is actually showing you a particular kind of bone called a flat bone. Flat bones are, these flat bones really aren't that flat, right? They're curved. These are the bones of your cranium, but in cross-sectional view, they're flat. So you have compact bone on the outer surface, compact bone on the inner surface, spongy bone in between. It's kind of like a sandwich, all right? So that's what makes that a flat bone. Okay, and the distribution of red marrow is shown in this picture. So where do you have red marrow? Everywhere that's red in that picture. Okay, so you see it's the flat bones of the skull, the cranial bones. You see it's also the sternum, ribs, and vertebrae, the hip bones. And look there, the proximal ends of the humerus, each humerus, and the proximal end of each femur. Now this is in an adult. In a child, they're so little that the red marrow actually extends further out, down into the limbs. This information is important because when you have to give someone an x-ray, it matters. What do x-rays do to DNA? X-rays mutate DNA. Remember, that's why we need melanin in our skin, is to absorb the UV. So X-rays, like UV rays, are going to mutate DNA, And the cells in your red marrow are very busy making new blood cells, which means they're very susceptible to any mutations that would arise that could cause cancer. So we're really careful about radiation. Have y'all ever had x-rays done? Tooth x-rays, if nothing else. Okay, but sonograms are not radiation. So the way you do it is different. Have you ever had your teeth x-rayed?
Yes.
Okay, so what do? They put that big lead apron on you and they leave the room. And then they zap you with that little focused x-ray beam. And they're just trying to make sure that you don't have any stray radiation. So when my husband broke his wrist, the x-ray tech put the wrist down on the table. He wore an apron. She had him swathed. And, you know, they were only focusing in right there on his broken wrist. That's a low level of radiation, but yeah, that's an issue. Or when you get IV radiation. Yeah, you do have to worry about that. So that's a different problem. But it's important if you're the x-ray tech to be able to assure people if they have a broken hand that there's no red marrow there. That's the point of this discussion. All right, so of our cells in bone, here are 4 types. Which one was the stem cell? A progenitor means the ancestor. Your progenitors are your great-great-great-great-grandparents. I don't care how many greats you want to count. So which one of these is the ancestor? They're all osteo something. The osteoprogenitor is the stem cell. What do osteoblasts do? They make new bone. What do osteocytes do? No, that's the class they're going to break down bone. Osteocytes maintain mature bone matrix. In fact, an osteoblast turns into an osteocyte. Not all of them do, but the ones that get trapped in bone do. Okay, so we'll go through these kind of one by one. Osteoprogenitor cells are the stem cells derived from mesenchyme. Does anybody remember mesenchyme? It's back when we first started studying connective tissue. Mesenchyme is the original embryonic connective tissue. So mesenchymal cells have the capacity to differentiate into fibroblasts or bone-forming cells or cartilage-forming cells. And in this case, they're forming the osteoprogenitor cells. And the osteoprogenitor cells being the stem cells, their offspring, for the most part, become osteoblasts. And what do osteoblasts do? They are the ones that make the bone. Okay, so they're located initially in the periosteum and the endosteum. That's the layer on the outside of the bone, and all those layers on the inside of the bone. So, boom, that's what they are. Okay, so we start with osteoprogenitors, and then we move on to osteoblasts. Osteoblasts very often just sit in a connected layer on the surfaces of bone, whether it's on the inner layer of the periosteum or on the surface of a spongy bone. They're just going to sit there, and they make something called osteoid. And osteoid is basically the first step in making new bone. So osteoid is organic. It's sort of a semi-solid. It's got a lot of collagen fibers in it. And then as part 2, the osteoid will calcify into bone matrix. So as these osteoblasts form new bone, if they don't stay on the surface, that is, if the osteoblast gets totally surrounded by bone, then it's kind of stuck. It's like painting yourself in a corner. What are you going to do? Can't go anywhere. So once they become entrapped in the matrix they produce, they quit being osteoblasts because they can't form bone anymore. Is that all pretty reasonable as a starting point? So what do they become once they're entrapped? Osteocytes. And so the mature bone cells that are derived from osteoblasts are the osteocytes. They quit making bone because they've got nowhere to put it. What they do mostly is regulate factors like the pH and the little bit of extracellular fluid that surrounds them, and in so doing they maintain the bone matrix. They also have this really cool ability to detect mechanical stress. And they talk to each other, they're connected to each other, they communicate with each other, and when they detect mechanical stress on the bone, that activates a thickening of the bone. That is new deposition of bone matrix. We've kind of harnessed that ability of osteocytes to detect mechanical stress. So part of my husband's therapy to regain his bone strength is doing weight-bearing exercises. And part of it is they use a bone stimulator, which actually sends sound waves into the bone. And those sound waves are mechanical, right? So they stimulate an increase in bone density. So the flip side of this is also true. If you don't put mechanical stress on a bone, then it's not stimulated to maintain its density. So what we find particularly as people age, if they're not doing weight-bearing exercises, their bones actually lose bone mass. So y'all particularly need to keep that in mind. Once you hit your 30s, it's like you switch gears from young, youthful bone building to all of a sudden you're like, yeah, I'm not making new bone unless you tell me I have to. And the way you tell yourself you have to is by doing weight-bearing exercises. Okay, so here you see this sort of transition from osteoprogenitor cells at the top, maturing into osteoblasts. I don't like that picture of an osteoblast because I don't think it shows how many little cellular processes it has. Look at the osteocyte at the bottom, and you see how it has those long fingery projections on it? Those are just called cell processes, and that allows the osteocytes to talk to each other. I'm going to tell you osteoblasts have those as well. And they actually, because they sit side by side, they stay connected to each other, probably with things like desmosomes and gap junctions that allow them to stay physically connected and to talk to each other. Okay, so the osteoclasts, remember, are the big giant guys. They're actually formed by fusion of cells into one giant multinuclear cell that's phagocytic. What does it mean to be phagocytic? What's phagocytosis? That was back from the cell chapter. Phagocytosis is eating. That is taking in large amounts of stuff. So what they do is they secrete some enzymes out of their, what we call the ruffled border, which is really just microvilli. They secrete enzymes out of the ruffled border that helps digest the calcium out and to break down the osteoid, the organic part, into little pieces that can then be picked up and swallowed. And so what happens where an osteoclast sits in one place, it just kind of bores a hole down into the bone and makes a little bone pit called a resorption lacuna. That's a term you don't need to remember. But you can imagine if your osteoclasts are sitting in one spot, that they just make these little holes in the bone. If they're kind of crawling along, they can make a little groove in the bone or just make a little path. And ordinarily, the osteoblasts are right behind them. And those osteoblasts are laying down new bone after the osteoclasts remove the old bone. But there's some disorders in which they kind of get out of sync with each other. And the main one we worry about is osteoporosis, which I'm sure you know occurs mostly in women. And the pores in osteoporosis, the holes that are formed by these osteoclasts, making these pits, and then the osteoblasts not coming along behind them to fill the pits back in. And when we get into hormonal control, we'll see how that happens. All right, so here you see a giant osteoclast formed by the fusion of bone marrow cells. Those bone marrow cells are probably macrophages of some kind, but we're not really sure. And you can see the ruffled border, which is really just microvilli, and you see the lysosomes. Lysosomes, you remember, secrete digestive enzymes. And the pit that's formed is called the resorption lacuna. Okay, everybody got osteoclasts? They're actually my favorite kind of cell. They're just big and lovely. Okay, so now we'll focus a little bit on the bone matrix. The matrix of bone, remember, has those two components, organic and inorganic. The osteoid is the organic component. It's got a lot of collagen in it, which we know makes it tough, but also makes it resilient, so it gives bone tensile strength. That is, you can bend a bone without it breaking. You don't think of bones as being flexible usually, do you? No, but imagine the last time you had, I don't know, last Thanksgiving you had turkey, and if you eat the drumsticks off the turkey, sometimes those little leg bones get pretty baked, and they're very brittle. So without the osteoid, the bone is too brittle, and that's what we mean by tensile strength. You can put tension on it, and it's less likely to break.
That one, like your elbows are covered.
That's a joint thing, so no, that would be different. So generally, we don't think of bone flexibility until we lose it, because if you lose it, your bones are very brittle, and they break too easily. So osteoid is the organic, it's mostly collagen, and it gives the bones tensile strength. On the other hand, the inorganic components are mostly calcium. Primarily, it's in the form of calcium phosphate, and you do need to remember that phosphate is there. The crystals that form are called hydroxyapatite. You do not need to know the formula for that. Okay, it would help you to remember hydroxyapatite is the form of the mineral found in bone. It's got calcium and phosphate in it. Yes, it also has hydroxide, but I don't really care. When you dissolve this stuff, the hydroxide just becomes water. So that's no big deal. But when you break down bone because you need calcium, you also have to deal with the phosphate that's released. So you have to remember the phosphate because it's going to potentially cause problems if you don't. So calcium phosphate is the main thing you need to remember. And then there's other things in there that we don't really care that much about. Calcium carbonate, sodium, magnesium ions, well, they're everywhere, right? If you have radiation exposure, depending on what kind of radiation it is, there's a radioactive form of strontium. Strontium is underneath the calcium in the periodic table. So strontium can get into bones, and if it's radioactive strontium, it's sitting there radiating and causing potentially bone cancer, other kinds of cancer. So anytime there's a radioactive leak at a nuclear power plant, we worry about the possibility of radioactive strontium getting into bones. Okay, so the calcium, of course, makes the bone hard and makes the bones rigid. Okay? So the proportion of organic to inorganic substances, it's usually about 1/3 organic and 2/3 inorganic. 1/3 organic, 2/3 inorganic. And you have to have the osteoid laid down before the calcium. So generally, if there's a deficiency of calcium in the diet, then you got osteoid, but you got no calcium, so the bones just don't become hard. They just stay soft. And depending on, let's go back. Hang on one sec. Let me see if it's in there. Nope. All right, so I'm going to give you some terms for what happens when, as soon as I can get this to behave. Okay, let's see if that's going to work. Yeah, it is. All right, so when you have soft bones from a calcium deficiency, in children, this causes a condition called rickets. Have you ever heard of rickets? Rickets can occur in adults, but usually it persists into adulthood. So rickets is a problem in children who are not getting enough calcium in their diet. Generally, this is malnutrition. In other words, they're getting enough food to eat, they're just getting not enough of the right foods. So if mama lets them have juice and cookies instead of making them drink milk, then they may not get enough calcium. They may get heavy because they're getting enough calories, probably too many, but it makes the bones very soft. So if you put a heavy body on soft bones in a toddler who's learning to walk, what do you think happens to the leg bones? they don't just become weak, they're soft, and so they bend. So you get bowed legs as a sign of rickets. In adults, if you have adults who had fine bone density in their younger years, but as they got old, they became restricted in their diet, you have a condition called osteomalacia, which is softening of the bones. The bone just gets soft, even though they used to be fine and hard. You see osteomalacia generally in elderly people on a fixed diet. And depending on their lifestyle and the reason they're not getting enough calcium, they may have deformities of the vertebral column, the pelvic girdle may flatten, even sometimes the skull flattens if they lay in bed a lot. So osteomalacia is softening of a bone, or of the bones generally in an adult. Okay, so that's the importance of those. And again, we'll come back and talk about that in terms of the regulation of those things as well. All right, why are you not letting me have the next slide? There we go. So we're going to start with the formation of osteoid, get it calcified. All that requires certain nutrients. You need enough protein in your diet to get that osteoid form. You know you need vitamin D to absorb calcium. Vitamin C we hadn't really talked about, but you need vitamin C for collagen formation. Now, where do we get vitamin C from?
You can get it in orange juice, but you said it's not natural.
Yeah, no, it's actually natural in orange juice. It's vitamin A and D and calcium that are not natural in orange juice, but citrus fruit, very full of vitamin C. Actually, tomatoes and peppers have more vitamin C than oranges do. So if you're eating fresh tomatoes and peppers, you're getting plenty of vitamin C. It's not hard to get. It's pretty much abundant in fresh fruits. Actually, most other animals make their own vitamin C. It's only in primates that it's required. In us, the enzyme, or one of the enzymes necessary to make vitamin C, mutated in our primate ancestors, but those primates were getting all the vitamin C they needed from fruit, and so it was a neutral mutation to them. Okay, bone resorption, the reabsorption or destruction and removal of bone matrix. This, of course, is the job of the osteoclasts. We're going to use proteolytic enzymes. What does that name tell you? Proteolytic. Proteo for protein. Lytic or lysis means to break. So a proteolytic enzyme is an enzyme that breaks down protein. So those lysosomes in the osteoclasts will release their enzymes. Those osteoclasts also release hydrochloric acid, and calcium and phosphate get dissolved, and the matrix is reabsorbed. You are doing this anytime your blood calcium level gets too low. And we'll talk about the regulation of that, but honestly, if you're not getting enough blood calcium on a regular basis, you're going to activate your osteoclasts and break down bone. Now, if you absorb calcium and everything else you need later, then you'll build it back. So generally, at your stage of life, you've got an even balance. You're in homeostasis. You're going to maintain your bone density over the course of a long enough period of time. But remember, as you get older, that may change. Okay, so we studied this in lab last week. This is on your lab quiz on Wednesday, right? The parts of the compact bone, so I'm not going to go over that. Here's the three-dimensional view again. Oh, what did we just do? For some reason that ended. It ended my PowerPoint. Let me pause this for a minute. Okay, so in this image you can kind of get that three-dimensional view. There's your periosteum on the left with the fibrous and cellular layers and the perforating fibers. We're looking now at the compact bone, and what I want you to recognize is that you have different kinds of layers of bone. Remember, a layer of bone is called a lamella. So you have external circumferential lamellae that go around the whole shaft of the bone, and then you have the concentric lamellae or circumferential lamellae on the inside. You have the lamellae of the osteon, and then do you see the ones labeled interstitial lamellae on the far right? Kind of the second term down. I know that's tiny to read. Those are kind of left over from old central canals. Remember the osteoclasts are kind of breaking it down and building new. So the organizing principle of compact bone is the blood vessels. So you see the blood vessels in the perforating canals, which go horizontally, and the central canals, which are in the middle of each osteon. Those blood vessels are accompanied by nerves as well. Have you ever broken a bone? Yeah, I did once. It hurts. And it bleeds. Crazy. So the thing about bone, you remember we said cartilage is avascular? Because if you put too much pressure on it, it would just break the blood vessels. Same with dense fibrous connective tissue. Poorly vascularized, because if you put too many blood vessels in it, it makes it weak. The thing about bone is it's really good and hard. So you're safe most of the time putting blood vessels in bone because it doesn't usually break. And the other aspect of that makes it even better is because it's got such a great blood supply, this tissue can heal, as you know. If you break a bone, it's going to bleed, you're going to get a blood clot, and then it's going to heal. So that's the nice thing about bone is that it can heal. All right, so in this close-up, you're seeing a couple things. In the top figure, you're seeing that the collagen fibers orient in opposite directions in each layer, so that no matter which way you twist that bone, it's got some collagen fibers to resist that. That's your tensile strength. And then in the lower picture, you see the osteocyte with its little cellular processes. Those osteocytes literally touch each other through these little tiny canals called the canaliculi. And the ones in the innermost layer are going to reach through into that central canal. That central canal is full of nutritious extracellular fluid supplied by that artery. The vein, of course, is draining off any waste products. And each layer of osteocytes connecting to the layer outside of it is feeding it. So there's actually a continuous layer of extracellular fluid all the way from the central canal through to the outermost layer of the osteocytes. They're all connected through those little canaliculi. All right, and here we are in spongy bone, and spongy bone does not have blood vessels in it, but generally spongy bone is surrounded by red marrow, and red marrow is well supplied with blood. So you don't need blood vessels in the spongy bone because you don't have as many layers, and again, those canaliculi will connect all the way to the outside and feed the osteocytes that are the deepest. See the little openings in the lower right picture. Little canaliculi opening at the surface, and that's refreshing their extracellular fluid. So bone is well supplied with nutrients, and compact bone is very vascularized. All right, so this is just a summary of the kinds of connective tissue and the differences between them. So you've got osteoblasts versus chondroblasts, osteocytes versus chondrocytes, calcium only in bone, not in cartilage, extensive blood supply in mature bone, and of course cartilage we know is avascular. All right, so we're going to pause here. We'll talk about growth when we get back from our break.
Are there school chiropractors here? Are they
No, we don't have chiropractors. We do have an MD over at Rogers Nursing, second floor. We have a clinic. She could refer you if you needed something, but I don't know. We don't do chiropractic for the most part. We do also have a physical therapy program, but I don't think they just work on students either. We also have a personal fitness program, but you have to sign up for that, so that's a different thing. So no, we don't. There are lots of chiropractors in this area, though. So we probably could get a referral if you needed it. All right, we're going to talk about how the skeleton grows, and we're going to start with cartilage because the skeleton begins its life as cartilage in embryonic development. Remember the little stained pig we saw, a little pig fetus? Pink was where it had already started converting to bone, but but the rest of the skeleton is cartilage. Now, not all of it is cartilage. We'll see when we get there that some bones don't form as cartilage first, but the ones that do form by one of these two kinds of growth, interstitial growth and appositional. Interstitial means from within, and appositional means growth on the outside. Okay, so let's take a look. And here in this series of picture, you're looking in the blue background of each of our 4 pictures of cells. That blue background is the cartilage matrix, as you can see in the orientation picture at the top. So you have one cell, it divides into 2 cells. Those 2 cells start to form new matrix, and as they do, they push apart from each other. And the secret to their success is the cartilage is still very new and very soft. So they can literally increase the volume of cartilage because it's still pretty soft. So imagine soft set jello, right? Not quite all the way hard yet, just sort of semi-hard. So that's interstitial growth, and you can do that in new cartilage. So basically during embryonic development, maybe early childhood. You guys can't do this anymore. We're all a little too old for that. So what we do is appositional growth, which occurs only on the surface, right up under the perichondrium. And you're just like an onion making new layers. You're making new layers on the outside. The cells there can still divide, and they can form new matrix, but they're forming it on the surface, so you're just getting a new layer of cartilage on the surface. Everybody understand the difference between interstitial growth and appositional growth? Interstitial from within, appositional on the surface. Okay, so during early embryonic development, you can have both kinds of growth, interstitial and appositional, but as it matures, that cartilage becomes semi-rigid, no more interstitial growth. And after that, at your age, definitely appositional growth. All right, so then once we have that cartilage, then we can ossify it. So ossification or osteogenesis is the formation of bone tissue. And yes, it begins in embryonic development, but it continues. You still have ossification going on. Do y'all remember we learned the parts of the sternum last week? Do you remember that little xiphoid process was missing on some of our skeletons?
Yes.
You remember why?
Because they are in like older people.
Only in older people is it ossified. Right, so it's still cartilage. You guys are young. It's still cartilage. You know what? I'm pretty sure mine's bone, because it usually ossifies in your 50s. So this process of ossification goes on not just in embryonic development or in early childhood or even just in adolescence. It's still occurring. Okay, so it starts between the 8th and 12th weeks of embryonic development. And look, there are 2 different kinds, intramembranous or endochondral. The term endochondral means within the cartilage. So that's the kind we have already been talking about. But that intramembranous ossification, that's the other kind that occurs. And in intramembranous ossification, you start with, a membrane. And it's a fibrous membrane that covers the brain and is the base tissues from the facial bones, the mandible, and the central part of the clavicle, which is a really weird, kind of an odd list. This is sometimes called dermal ossification because that dermal layer is the fibrous membrane from which this ossified tissue will arise. So yes, you need to know this list. Flat bones of the skull, some. You don't need to know which ones of the facial bones. The main part of the mandible, not the whole part of the mandible. Y'all learned the parts of the mandible last week, right?
Yes.
So you remember there's a body, which is the main portion of it. That's the part that forms by dermal ossification. And then the clavicle we'll meet when we do lab on Wednesday. The clavicle is your collarbone, and the middle part of it forms from dermal bone. Okay, so it just starts with the mesenchyme grows blood vessels. Because bone is well vascularized, it makes sense, doesn't it? You get the blood vessels in there, and then that triggers bone formation. And we're going to see the same with endochondral ossification. So we start with what we call an ossification center, and that's where the blood vessels first start to thicken. And some of the cells become osteoprogenitors, and some of those then specialize into osteoblasts, and they start bone formation. Different bones have different ossification centers. In general, for your cranial bones, you have one in the middle of each cranial bone. So where your parietal bones are, you know where those are? Where are your parietal bones? Where's your frontal bone? Frontal bone's your forehead, right? And it starts out in the fetus as two. So there's a center of ossification here and here. For parietal bones, center of ossification here and here. You just start with one little center of ossification for each of those bones, and as they expand, when they finally meet each other, they form a suture. Okay? So that's not too hard to figure out. That bone starts out as what we call woven bone. It's just kind of haphazard. Wherever the capillaries grow, that's where the bone is going to form. It looks like a pretty disorganized spongy bone. And that woven bone is just like step one. And then the blood vessels kind of organize themselves, and they form those nice central canals, and they form the layers of bone we call lamellar bone. Okay, the blood vessels are the organizers of bone tissue. Blood vessels first, bone comes after. All right, so that's not too big of a deal. Here's some diagrams that show you those steps. There's your ossification center starting on the far left. And then in the second picture, you've got some bone forming, and in the third picture, you can see that it's kind of haphazardly woven bone, where you have some what looks like spongy bone on the surface, and finally in the far right, your lamellar bone, because you've got definitely compact bone on both the outer surface and the inner surface. So no big deal for those. All right, our other kind, endochondral ossification, we're going to start with cartilage. That cartilage is a little looks just like the little bone that it's going to turn into. So most of the bones of the skeleton, the limb bones, definitely the pelvis, the vertebrae, the ends of the clavicle, and you should add to that list the ends of the mandible, where the mandible articulates. Okay, so we're going to start in the fetus with chondroblasts, which are making the cartilage during the 8th to 12th weeks of environments. That cartilage is going to calcify. This is a really weird thing. Cartilage isn't supposed to have calcium. And when cartilage calcifies, it actually kills the cartilage because the cartilage doesn't have a blood supply. So if you put a calcium shell around it, you form this collar of bone around the shaft, then it kills the cartilage. So that makes holes. The chondrocytes start dying, and that makes holes. And that lets as the blood vessels grow in, it lets the osteoclasts come in and get rid of that stuff, and then osteoblasts start secreting osteoids. So you calcify the cartilage to kill it. You get I know it doesn't say that, but you do get osteoclasts in there to get rid of that calcified cartilage. The blood vessels are growing in. It's the blood vessels that are the key. Step one, put some blood vessels in there, okay? And then you're going to get that collar of bone around the shaft, which is called the diaphysis. So in the diaphysis, we get a primary ossification center. That's where the blood vessels first come in. They expand by growing new capillaries. That allows osteoblasts to move in. That allows osteoid to form. And most of the bone shafts, that is the shafts of long bones, are going to be formed by the 12th week of development in a human embryo, okay? So you don't have the ends of the bones calcified yet. They're still cartilage. But those bones then can get longer and thicker as they continue to grow. All right, so it's calcium first, it's cartilage first. The cartilage gets calcified, blood vessels grow in, the cartilage dies, gets replaced by bone. And you shouldn't say that cartilage turns into bone. The cartilage is removed and replaced by bone. All right, secondary ossification centers form in the ends of long bones. That's the epiphyses, those are the ends. And again, the hyaline cartilage degenerates after it calcifies. Blood vessels and osteoprogenitor cells come in, and you get secondary ossification centers. So the osteoclasts form a medullary cavity in the shaft of the bone. And in the ends of the bones, you're going to have compact bone on the surface and spongy bone on the inside. All right, so keep that in mind. The bone replaces the cartilage. There are only two places in a long bone where cartilage persists, and that's at the articular cartilage. Do you remember what that is? What's the articular cartilage? Okay, if you don't remember, write it down this time. The articular cartilage is the cartilage at the joint surface. It covers the ends of bones where they join with another bone. Articular cartilage at the joint surface. And then the other place is at the epiphyseal plate. That's the growth plate. The epiphyseal plate is where there's cartilage left between the shaft, which is ossifying, and the end, which is ossifying. And we'll look at a picture of that in just a minute. But that allows the cartilage to continue to grow. Eventually, that cartilage gets converted to bone, and growth at that point stops. Okay, it says it occurs between the age of 10 and 25. Let me just tell you, most 10-year-olds are still growing. It starts to occur in some of the bones at the age of 10. But in women, usually by the age of 16, and in men, usually by the age of 18, you're just about done with all your growth. You might have a little bit more of contribution to adult height in your tibia and fibula at the ankle, at the distal ends, but not a whole heck of a lot. So do y'all know when you quit getting taller? What height you are now and when you reach that height? How about for you personally? Do you know? Do you ever measure your height? 5'2"? How long have you been 5'2"? Don't know, long time? Yeah. Yeah, I was 5'7" in high school, and then I kind of quit. So, actually, I've shrunk a little bit, getting into my 60s. Starting to shrink. It's depressing. Don't want to talk about that. All right, so here you have the diagrams in your book, and what I want you to pay attention to on the far right in the newborn is the epiphyseal plates. So where are the epiphyseal plates in that picture? See if I can point them out for you. Right here and right here. Do you see them? Do you see how the cartilage cells, the chondrocytes, are kind of shown in little rows or columns? Can you see the little dots in there kind of radiating? So that's the way they grow, and they're actually increasing the length of that bone. But while you have new cartilage growing in the middle, on the shaft side, the old cartilage is getting converted to bone, replaced by bone. So you kind of make it thicker in the outward directions, but you're replacing that cartilage on the inside. And so those epiphyseal plates eventually are going to ossify. And as soon as it ossifies, that's it. That bone cannot get any longer than it already is. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, and then looking at this looks a lot like the picture that we saw, or actually the specimen we saw. So this is at 10 weeks. You can see the shafts of the femurs and the tibia and fibula here, and of the little forearm bones and the humerus. And then this, that's a skull bone, so that is intramembranous ossification. All right? So study those in your book. All right, and then this is just a continuation. So what you see in the far right is the epiphyseal plates are gone. They're replaced by epiphyseal lines. And looking at the x-rays, you can see on the left that there's a shadow where that epiphyseal plate is, right? Right there. And then on the right, it's gone. Okay, so in lab we'll see that in a little bit more detail. Okay, so bones don't quit growing once you've gotten as tall as you're going to get. Bone growth in length is going to stop, but bone growth in diameter can continue. And again, those terms interstitial and appositional apply. So even when your bones have lost their epiphyseal plates, they can still get thicker. A lot of the thickness of those bones, though, is going to depend on what you do with them. So if you are a manual laborer and you use your arms a lot, then your arm bones are going to get thicker, and probably the pectoral girdle bones as well. So a lot of it just depends on usage. Bone remodeling is going to continue lifelong. In some bones it's faster than others, but we'll take a look at that in a minute. I used to put a lot of emphasis on the epiphyseal plate. I've kind of quit doing that. I just think there's more important things to worry about memorizing, but I want to show you a picture of the epiphyseal plate, and what I want you to pick out on here is number 2, the zone of proliferating cartilage. That cartilage there is just making more cartilages basically as fast as it can. And you remember the steps after that is it's going to get calcified and then it's going to get removed by osteoclasts. So down in zone 5, that's where the osteoclasts have moved into it and are removing it and either leaving it empty as medullary cavity or replacing it with new bone. So as we look at this picture of the epiphyseal plate, what you can see here, do you see these little stacks of chondroblasts mostly, and they're growing this way. They're dividing vertically to make that epiphyseal plate thicker and thicker and thicker. But down here in the bottom, what's happening? From there down, that's where the osteoclasts are starting to invade. Okay, and up here at the very top, the reserve cartilage, that's just kind of sitting there to make sure it stays connected. So proliferating cartilage is where all the action is. If you break a bone at the epiphyseal plate and you disrupt that connection, then that bone quits growing longer. And that's one of the most severe kinds of breaks a long bone can have, is a break at the epiphyseal plate. Because if you do that in a kid and that bone quits growing, then if it's a leg bone, they're going to have one leg shorter than the other. If it's in the leg itself with the tibia and the fibula, one of the bones will be longer than the other. That makes the ankle kind of turn awkwardly. And the only solution to that is repeated surgeries to keep re-breaking it so that it has room to grow. So that is not a happy outcome. Okay, so we understand that bone growth and length is at the epiphyseal plates, and I think we have a handle on that. All right, any questions about that? By the way, one other thing about that, these, the end of growth of epiphyseal plates is kind of on a well-known timeline. So there are specific plates that disappear at particular times in your life, and they can use that as forensic evidence. When they find skeletal remains, they can date the skeleton. They can say this is a kid between the ages of 6 and 10, based on which epiphyseal plates have finished fusing. So that's kind of an interesting use of it. And we can see those epiphyseal plates on x-rays, right? All right, so bones can continue to grow in diameter. They can get thicker. This is all part of bone remodeling. And from infancy on, you don't just make the bone thicker. On the inside of the bone, you're also reabsorbing it in the medullary cavity. That cavity is found only in the long bones. So remodeling is a lifelong event, but this shows you just from an infant to an adult, not only does the bone get thicker and the diameter of the entire bone get wider, but the medullary cavity, that hollow space in the interior, also gets wider, and that's by reabsorption by osteoclasts. So remodeling continues lifelong, and it can shift if you break a bone. So once you break a bone, if the bone is not set properly and it grows back crooked, it will thicken abnormally and the interior structure of it will actually reorient. Most bones remodel at different rates depending on how much pressure is put on them. So the joint surfaces are going to remodel faster and more often than the shafts. So the shaft of the femur, I think I read that it takes about 50 years or so to completely replace it. So I don't know what they mean by lifetime. I'm hoping that I live long enough for it to replace. All right, I told you mechanical stress can shift the thickness of the bone. It talks to the osteocytes, and they talk to the osteoblasts and tell the osteoblasts, hey, we're getting a lot of pressure here, let's make it thicker. And we actually use that in physical anthropology when they study skeletal remains of individuals. If the right arm bones are heavier than the left arm bones, then that tells you that was a right-handed individual who was doing something more with their right arm than with their left arm. Okay. The opposite, though, is true if you have someone who's paralyzed. What happens to bone density in a paralyzed limb where there's no weight bearing? They get very weak. They can just reabsorb the bone to the point where just falling out of a wheelchair may be enough to break the bone. So kind of works for you, but it can work against you as well. And in space, astronauts actually do have to have weight-bearing exercises or resistance exercises to maintain their bone mass. So we increase bone mass from weight-bearing activities. That's not swimming. Swimming's good for you. It's good for your cardiovascular fitness. Does nothing for your bone density. So you have to do weight-bearing exercise like lifting weights or walking or running. And as you guys get older, you need to pay attention to your vertebral column and do trunk exercises that put weight on the vertebrae so they will maintain their thickness. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about the hormones that are regulating the skeletal system. The first one, very simple, is growth hormone. For each of the hormones, you need to know, write this list down. You need to know the gland that secretes it. You need to know how it is stimulated to be secreted. And you need to know what that hormone does. So growth hormone actually works in two different ways. It stimulates the liver to produce its own hormone called somatomedin. And both growth hormone and somatomedin stimulate the growth of cartilage. Well, what does that do to your bones? If you're stimulating cartilage secretion, remember growth in bones occurs in the cartilage. So by stimulating cartilage growth, you're stimulating bone growth. Okay? It also, by the way, stimulates muscle growth as well, which is kind of a convenient thing. Before we move on to thyroid hormone, let's talk about some problems associated with growth hormone. So one of the problems associated with growth hormone is dwarfism. And its opposite, which is giantism or gigantism. So obviously dwarfism is if you don't have enough growth hormone, and giantism if you have too much. And our terms for that, of course, are hypo and hyper. Does anybody know what gland secretes growth hormone? Which gland secretes it? It's the anterior pituitary. So generally, dwarfism is a genetic condition. So if you're born with a genetic defect, that means either your body can't secrete growth hormone or can't respond to it, then you have what we call pituitary dwarfism. You're pretty well proportioned, you're just small. Okay, there are other things that can cause other kinds of dwarfism. So pituitary dwarfism specifically is a deficiency of growth hormone. Giantism, on the other hand, very often is due to a tumor, a hypersecreting tumor of the pituitary. And the treatment for that is removal of the tumor. Generally removal of the pituitary. Now, y'all know where the pituitary sits. As you saw last week in lab, it sits right smack in the middle of your skull in that sella turcica on the sphenoid. So I've had friends, at least two, that have had to have the surgery done. And it's not fun.
What is the height to have giantism?
Huh?
What is the height?
It's not a matter of height cut off. It's a matter of what's causing. So if your growth hormone is high, then they would say you're a giant. If your growth hormone's perfectly normal and you happen to be 6'8", well, that's just your genetics. So that doesn't make you a giant. Okay? So to get to the pituitary, what they do is they go through the ethmoid. Now, where's your ethmoid? You'll have to know that by Wednesday, right? Yes. It's in the skull. The ethmoid, to me, is the bone of the nasal cavity. It's right smack in the middle of the nose. Okay, so to get to that, you would think, well, maybe they're just going to go through your nose. No, that would be disfiguring. So what they do is they go under your top lip, under there, and they make an incision there, and then they kind of angle backwards to get through the nose to get to the pituitary. Not fun, because then they have to pack your nose full of gauze. Yeah, that to me, it was like, when my friend was telling me about that, I was like, no, just put me to sleep and I don't need to wake up, you know, just put me out of our misery here. All right, so that's a little bit on growth hormone. We actually study the hormones officially next semester, but we can't wait. We have to talk about things now. So that much you need to know. The thyroid hormone, so what's the gland that secretes the thyroid? Any guesses? What's the gland that secretes thyroid hormone? The thyroid gland. That's exactly correct. And the thyroid hormone doesn't have a special effect on the skeletal system, but because it makes all your cells metabolically active at the right level, if you have a deficiency, that's hypothyroidism, then everything in your body slows down, and if your skeleton slows down, it slows down growing. It also, though, impairs nervous system development. So people with hypothyroidism that's been untreated since childhood have profound mental retardation. They're just simply never cognitively fully developed. They're also very short, 3 to 4 feet tall, max. They're very sweet. They tend not to have a lot of other physical problems. They're not proportioned exactly right, but it depends on how severe it was and how early in life it developed. Okay, and then the sex hormones. Now, why on earth do we need to talk about sex hormones in the skeletal system? That's because of puberty. So you remember you had a growth spurt at puberty, and that's because sex hormones have an anabolic effect. That is, they increase protein manufacture. And so as you start to secrete large amounts of hormones at puberty, you get a growth spurt. That's at the epiphyseal plates. And it also accelerates the conversion of cartilage to bone. So even though your bones get longer, you hasten the closing of the epiphyseal plates. So once puberty sets in, you got a few years left of growth. You're going to get a growth spurt, but then it's going to stop. So people that experience puberty early in life, younger than average, tend to be shorter as adults. People who experience puberty later in life have a longer growth period at the adolescent growth rate, and so they tend to be taller. So just as anecdotal evidence, I have a friend who is very tall. Her daughter, likewise, is very tall, and she told me her daughter didn't start puberty. She was like 16. What's the normal age for onset of puberty in girls? 12 or 13, and in fact, alarmingly, it's getting younger, and we don't know exactly why. It's probably a combination of nutrition and artificial light. But if you're genetically predisposed to have puberty onset at 16, you're going to wind up being taller because you had a longer childhood growth period followed by a later puberty. Okay, so some other things that can affect the skeleton. Glucocorticoids are stress hormones. Now, I'm not going to ask you to learn where these come from. Well, it wouldn't hurt you. They come from the adrenal glands. So you should think of your adrenal glands as your stress glands anyway. So glucocorticoids are stress hormones from the adrenal glands. And glucocorticoids don't have as their job ruining your skeleton. It's a side effect. So what glucocorticoids do, one of the things they do is they suppress inflammation and white blood cell reactions. So your immune system, they suppress your immune system. So if you have a child or even an adult with an immune disorder, whether it's asthma or arthritis, and that person is on glucocorticoids like prednisone is one of them, then you find that the bones are increasingly frail.
Does that cause arthritis?
Arthritis is a disease for which we use glucocorticoids, so no. Doesn't cause arthritis because arthritis is specifically at the joints. But it can make the bones fragile if you've got someone on these treatments for a really long period of time, or if it's kids. So very often what we see in kids that have had transplants, they're on immune suppressing drugs because they have a transplant, that they're abnormally short. So a lot of our child actors back in the day were actually like almost adults, but they were short enough that they could play children because they were bone transplant or kidney transplants very often. So any immune suppressing drug given to children tends to stunt their growth because glucocorticoids are immune suppressors, but they also impair growth. All right, this one, serotonin's probably my favorite thing. Serotonin makes you feel good, okay? We don't necessarily know what serotonin is doing in bone, but we know that bone cells have serotonin receptors and that somehow it's regulating bone remodeling, okay? We have found so many different growth factors that stimulate bone growth or inhibit it or are actually produced by bone that this is just getting carried away. I don't want to get bogged down in it. I'm not testing you on serotonin. We just don't know enough about it. But there are other bone factors that we know exist, and you just got to keep your eyes open on that and find more. For example, we know that exercise stimulates the secretion of a hormone from the bones that then makes you feel good and helps neural cognition and increases muscle mass. So there's all kinds of things going on hormonally. We're just not going to worry about all that. All right, the last hormones we're going to look at are the hormones that regulate blood calcium levels. And I want you to keep in mind that even though we associate calcium with a skeleton, that's not its main job. So there you see four things that calcium is needed for. Muscle contraction, secretion, exocytosis is secretion, regulation of the heart rate, and blood clotting. Okay, all four of those are more important than I need my bones to be hard. We actually, as one of the anticoagulants that we use commercially, is one that gets all the calcium out of the blood. If you remove the calcium from the blood, it can't clot. So what was that condition I gave you the term for, of bleeding excessively? I was covering it so you would get the word root, hemo. Hemorrhage. Hemorrhage. So if your blood can't clot, you could bleed to death. Now, it's not usually from a calcium deficiency, honestly. But usually when we see calcium deficiencies, it's going to be those first three. I need my heart to contract, I need my muscles to contract, I need my neurons to send nerve impulses. So calcium in general, when you think of calcium in a physiological role, calcium's going to make something happen. Calcium's the trigger for action. It's going to make muscles contract, it's going to make nerves send impulses, it's going to make your blood clot. And the hormones that control blood calcium are calcitriol and parathyroid hormone. Those are the primary ones. There's a third one that's mostly important in children. All right, so we're going to look at calcitriol and parathyroid hormone. Calcitriol we met last week because calcitriol is the hormone that is formed by vitamin D, and we started it in the skin, right? So we have ultraviolet radiation converts cholesterol to vitamin D3, which is also called cholecalciferol, and that's too much information. You also absorb it in your diet. It goes to the liver. It goes from the liver to the kidneys to be finally converted to its active form called calcitriol. So if you remember vitamin D to calcitriol, and you remember skin to liver to kidneys, then you're pretty good, okay? All right, you need parathyroid hormone to get calcitriol to do anything. So these two hormones work together. Calcitriol and parathyroid hormone work together. Calcitriol's main job is to build calcium carriers in cell membranes. Okay, calcitriol builds the calcium carriers in the cell membranes. Parathyroid hormone can turn on those carriers. So you got to have them there, and then you have to switch them on when you need them. All right, so here's a little slide that shows you too much information. What do we need to remember from this? sunshine with ultraviolet radiation, or dietary intake from skin to liver to kidneys to get calcitriol from vitamin D. All right, parathyroid hormone comes from glands called the parathyroid glands. What does para tell you? Para means next to, beside, in the neighborhood of. Okay, so they're behind, they're actually embedded in the backside of the thyroid gland. There's 4 of them, 4 little parathyroid glands, and their job is to secrete this one hormone called parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone plus calcitriol stimulates the pulling of calcium into the blood. Okay? Rule number 1, these hormones put calcium into the blood. So if you've got these hormones active in bone, they're actually taking calcium out of the bone just to put it in the blood so your heart and your nerves and your muscles have enough calcium. In the kidneys, what they are doing is pulling calcium out of the urine before the urine's finished forming, so you're not losing calcium in urine. So we call that reabsorption. They reabsorb calcium from the kidneys, and they also stimulate the gut to absorb calcium from the food you ate. Make sense to everybody? So the goal of these hormones is to make sure your blood calcium level stays normal. And they get, calcitriol is kind of secreted in a steady state. You just kind of have it in the background to make sure those calcium carriers are there. PTH you secrete only when your calcium level in the blood drops too low. Okay, so calcitriol is kind of there in the background, making sure everybody's ready. You've got your little calcium carriers in your bone cells and your kidney cells and your gut cells. And then PTH gets secreted only when your blood calcium drops too low. Okay, what does it do in the bones? It increases osteoclast activity. What does that do? What do osteoclasts do? They break the bone matrix down, and that helps release the calcium for the bloodstream. Okay, so if you're chronically low in calcium at your age, are you getting enough calcium in your diets? Do you know what good sources of calcium are? Milk, dairy products in general. Orange juice if it's fortified with calcium. Read the labels, buy the stuff that's fortified. That's actually the best. Dairy or orange juice, because orange juice is very acidic and it takes acid to absorb that calcium. So if you're not getting enough dairy, then buy that orange juice, okay? Because if you're not getting enough calcium in your diet, then you're robbing it out of your bones. It depends on if they're careful or not. You can get enough calcium if you try, but the main sources of calcium are animal sources, not vegetable sources. So if you're vegan, you have to really work at getting enough calcium and B12 as well, okay? So anytime your blood calcium level dips too low, PTH gets secreted. And every time PTH is secreted, yeah, it's going to go to your gut, and yeah, it's going to go to your kidney, but mostly it's going to pull that calcium out of your bones. So here's just a diagram that shows what the stimulus is, low blood calcium level, and the receptors in the parathyroid glands. And the parathyroids are the control center. They secrete PTH. And PTH, it shows them working together in the bloodstream. That's not really where they work. They work in those organs. And then once your calcium level's back up to normal, your parathyroid glands quit secreting it. Now, what they don't talk about here, we need to kind of go back. And talk about in kids, I'm trying to get a blank sheet, but I'm not getting one, so ignore this for now. In children, there's another hormone called calcitonin, and you just quit secreting it once you've reached full height. Calcitonin comes from the thyroid gland. Calcitonin is secreted when you eat calcium, not you, because you're too old. In children, when they consume sufficient calcium and their calcium level in the blood goes up, they secrete calcitonin. And that tells the bone to put away the calcium. So calcitonin is for kids because it puts calcium into the bone. Secreted by the thyroid gland. When calcium level goes up, then you secrete calcitonin, and calcitonin sends calcium to the bone. If you do, you just don't absorb it. So there are people who take calcium supplements, and if you take too much of a calcium supplement, most of it's just going to get flushed down the toilet because you can only absorb so much. All right, so back to what this slide was showing, and that is effects of aging. So we talked about osteoporosis. It's called porosis because there are pores. There are spongy openings in the bone. Remember, that's from osteoclasts, just kind of going to town. So what happens in osteoporosis, and this is mostly in women, is post-menopause. So after menopause, you quit secreting the sex hormones for the most part. Estrogen is the primary female sex hormone, and estrogen stimulates osteoblasts. So does testosterone. So between estrogen and testosterone, you stimulate your osteoblasts throughout adulthood. Men don't go through menopause. So in general, they don't suffer from osteoporosis. They secrete a sufficient amount of testosterone lifelong. Women secrete some testosterone, again from the adrenal glands, weirdly enough, but at menopause, that level drops precipitously, and for the first 5 years post-menopause, you tend to lose a lot of bone mass. If you have a lot of bone mass to begin with, you can afford to lose some. But if you're bird-boned before menopause, then you have to worry about osteoporosis. If you have a family history of osteoporosis, if your mother, grandmother, aunt had osteoporosis, then you're more inclined to get it. So to avoid osteoporosis, make sure you get a good diet with enough calcium, do those weight-bearing exercises, and just make sure your bones are as dense as they can be. Osteopenia, anytime you see penia at the end, it means there's not enough. So osteopenia means just the bones are less dense than they ought to be. We see that in people who are paralyzed. We also see it in very old men. Typically, they don't have osteoporosis, but they may have osteopenia. So if your granddad is in his 90s and he just looks like he's shrunken down from the man he used to be, part of that is osteopenia. Part of it is loss of muscle mass. Even the vertebrae can actually compress a little bit, so you lose height as an adult. I used to be 5'7" 3/4". I'm 5.5 now. I'm a little unhappy about that loss of 1/4 of an inch, or 5'7.5". So I lost 1/4 of an inch. Not happy. So I'm watching it.
That's so weird.
But it's just compression of the vertebrae. And when we get to, we should have looked at that last week, but if you remind me on Wednesday, we'll get some out and I'll show you what they look like when they compress. All right, we're going to look at some other problems with bone. The first one, and probably the one that's most common, is fractures. So you've got different kinds of fractures. You do need to know the different kinds. A stress fracture. You see stress fractures in competitive athletes a lot. In basketball players, they may get a stress fracture of the heel bone because after that rebound, they're landing their 7-foot-tall frames on that, just the heel bone. So generally, a stress fracture is, it's not even just a thin break, it's a vertical. It breaks along the shaft. Sometimes they're hard to see on x-rays too, but hurts, and you figure out you've done it. Pathological fracture occurs if you already had bone disease. That could be osteoporosis, it could be osteopenia in someone who's paralyzed. It could also be caused by bone cancers. Bone cancers can cause a weakening in a bone that causes it to break. Okay, simple and compound, the other name for these. A simple fracture is also called a closed fracture. A compound fracture is also called an open fracture. Which one would you rather have, simple or compound? Simple, because compound means you got to worry about infection because you broke through the skin. Obviously, it's a worse break, too. I had a friend who had a compound fracture. Her car rolled over when she got clipped by a truck, commercial truck. her arm, the window was up, but her arm literally broke the window out, and she fractured it right at the elbow, compound fracture. She had infection in there that just took years to treat. They did bone grafts, they cut out infected bone, they put little embedded beads infused with antibiotics in it, and she finally healed, but she doesn't have near the freedom of movement she had before. So we don't like compound fractures. I'll show you my husband's if you want to see it, but it's kind of grisly looking. So once the fracture starts to heal, it says simple fractures can heal in 2 to 3 months. Let me just tell you it begins. I mean, it depends on how old you are. So when my daughter broke her wrist when she was 2, that's what we call a green stick fracture in children. But it's still mostly cartilage. It just cracks the little bone collar. So he put an ace bandage around it, which he promptly removed. So we had to rewrap it and put a sock over it and pin the sock to her sleeve to keep her from pulling it off in bed at night. He said, bring her back in a week. We'll x-ray her again. A week later, it was healed. In a week. 2-year-olds heal in a week. They don't have that much bone to begin with, and they're just really fast at it. My husband broke the humerus, his left humerus, way up here at the top when he was 40. 6 months later, he was still, waiting for it. I mean, it took a long time. Thicker bone, older guy, just takes longer. So it just depends. So 2 to 3 months, that's just like, I'm telling you, it totally depends on what you broke. And surgical intervention, his wrist has a plate in it now.
My brother has plates and screws.
Plates and screws. I'll show you a picture. Okay, so the steps, some terminology you need to know here. A hematoma is a blood clot. If it's under your skin, you call it a bruise. That's what a hematoma is. So if you have a fracture hematoma, remember that bones have a great blood supply. So if you break a bone, it's going to bleed. That's the first thing that's going to happen. And then that blood is going to clot, and that forms what we call a fracture hematoma. It can kind of hold all the broken ends of the bone together, but if you put any pressure on it, it's just going to break and bleed again. So the next step is all the cartilage cells and the fibroblasts of the periosteum will invade, and they're going to form this callus. A callus is a lump. So this fibrocartilage callus forms, and within that, then the blood vessels will start to grow back. So the job of the fibrocartilaginous callus is just to be stronger than the hematoma, to kind of knit the broken ends together so that they can start to heal. Even then, you don't want to put weight on it. Once you have the blood vessels infiltrating and they start to form new bone tissue, now you have a bony callus, now you could put weight on it. Okay, that's not a problem. And then step 4 can take years. Eventually that bone remodels. It may never look the same as it did before. So I broke my index finger, that one. And when you compare them side to side, that one's still thicker there than the other one is because it twisted. It was a spiral fracture, kind of twisted. So he wanted to put a pin in it, but I was 3 months pregnant, and I said, no, I'm not doing any anesthesia. He said it won't grow back right. I have full movement. I'm fine. It just looks a little funny. So it's finished remodeling. It's as different as it's going to get, but it's not back to what it was. All right, so you got some pictures of that. You need to know the 4 steps. You need to know them in order. You need to know basically what's happening in each one. And here we have a really complete list of all the kinds of fractures. These should, I'm wondering if they do, show up either in your practice quiz or in, yes, you're saying yes, they do, good. So use that to kind of practice them. I may show you some x-rays on the test, and you need to be able to distinguish the kinds of fractures. So look at that one at the top left. It says it's a comminuted fracture. What does that mean? Can y'all read that screen?
It says bone splintered.
Yeah, so you see the little bone splinters there, comminuted fracture. All right, so just as an example, y'all go through that list. Use your practice quiz to help you learn them all. Okay, I think that completes we just kind of raced through that. I want you to take the rest of your class time to work on something, okay? You can work on last week's lab if you want. You cannot go around and look at the quiz, right? But if you want to look at some bones, we can get those out. Or you can just work on your chapter summaries or your practice quizzes or something, okay? I'm going to post this lecture and